The two sisters had been bound together since the very first cries of their childhood, and in every corner of the village people knew that one could not be seen without the other. From dawn until dusk, their laughter blended like a shared song, and even when silence fell upon them, it was not an absence of words but a language of understanding that needed no speech. The older sister, though barely more than a girl herself, carried the quiet dignity of someone who felt her duty as protector. Her younger sister looked at her with a devotion so pure that even the harshness of the world could not extinguish it. They were poor, mocked by some, envied by others, but none of it seemed to touch them when they were together. Their bond was their wealth, their joy, their secret shield. The village around them was not kind. It was a place where gossip grew quicker than crops, and jealousy often bloomed where love should have thrived. Many families had turned bitter with hardship, their words sharp and their hands ready to point blame at anyone weaker. Yet, in the midst of this, the sisters created their own world. In the mornings they would fetch water from the river, walking barefoot along the dusty path, sharing jokes that only they understood. At night, when the moon bathed the land in silver, they would whisper dreams into each other's ears, dreams of leaving the cruelty of the village, of finding a place where no one would laugh at their misfortune or plot against their small happiness. The older sister's hands were always busy, cooking, mending, working, yet she never complained. Her younger one often tried to copy her, fumbling with the same tasks, and whenever she failed, they both laughed until their stomachs hurt. There was tenderness in those moments, a reminder that despite the harshness outside their hut, they had something unbreakable inside. Even the storms that swept across the sky, tearing at the thatched roofs, seemed softer when they sat side by side, clutching each other's hands. Their bond was the fire that kept the cold of the world at bay. Others in the village noticed this closeness, but not all looked on with kindness. Some whispered that such love between sisters was dangerous, that it made them too dependent on one another, that it would lead to jealousy if one ever married or gained favor. But the sisters did not care for such words. They knew what they had was rare and they clung to it with all their strength. The younger would often say, "If I am a bird, then you are my wings." The older would answer, "And if I am a tree, then you are the roots that hold me." It was their way of affirming that nothing could separate them. Their love also made them vulnerable. Because they drew strength from one another, any harm done to one was felt doubly by the other. The villagers, hardened by envy and suspicion, saw this as weakness. They could not understand how two girls, with so little wealth and power, still walked with heads held high, carrying joy in their hearts. That joy became a target. Cruel children teased them, throwing stones or mocking their patched clothes. Adults turned away when they asked for help, and even some relatives treated them with disdain. But each insult, each cruelty, was softened by the fact that when they returned to each other, they found comfort no one else could provide. It was the younger sister's voice that kept hope alive. She sang softly while they worked, little melodies she invented, and though her voice was not loud, it carried a strange sweetness that even the wind seemed to pause for. Her sister would listen with pride, telling her that one day her voice would carry far beyond the village. That belief, spoken with certainty, lit up the younger's eyes and gave her courage to keep singing even when mocked. The sound of that voice became part of their world, weaving through their lives like a thread of light. In the evenings, when the day's labors were done and the cruelty of the world seemed to close in on them, they would sit outside their hut, watching the horizon darken. They spoke of promises, never to abandon one another, never to let the world's cruelty tear them apart. These promises were sacred, more binding than anything else in their lives. They might not have had riches or the respect of the village, but they had each other, and that was enough. What they could not know was how fragile even the strongest bonds could seem when tested by envy and malice. The love they carried was a flame, but flames often draw the winds and winds can be merciless. For now, however, the two sisters lived in the glow of their bond, innocent and pure, unaware of how soon the world's cruelty would test the depth of their love, and how that love would echo far beyond the lives they had known. The seeds of envy often begin as small, careless whispers, but in the village where the two sisters lived, those whispers grew like weeds, choking out truth and kindness. At first it was only an occasional remark. Someone would glance at the way the sisters walked arm in arm, their heads bent together as though they shared a secret the world could never understand, and mutter, "It is not natural to be so bound to another. Something dark must tie them." Others would respond with knowing nods, adding tales of their own invention, and soon those small murmurs became heavy with suspicion. The sisters had done nothing to deserve such scrutiny. Their bond was simple love, pure and unselfish, but in a place where joy was scarce, even innocent happiness became a source of resentment. Women who struggled in loveless marriages saw the sisters' unity as a reminder of what they lacked. Men who prided themselves on strength felt unsettled that two poor girls could walk with dignity despite their hardships. Children who were used to cruelty did not understand how kindness could be given so freely between two people. And so the whispers began to shift, turning from mild suspicion into something darker. "They are cursed," some would say, watching the younger sister sing to the river as her older sibling fetched water. "Haven't you noticed how the water ripples differently when she cries or laughs? That is not natural." Others added, "It is the bond between them, it draws strange things. Spirits do not like when humans are too close. That is why storms circle their hut more often." Bit by bit, envy disguised itself as fear, and fear disguised itself as justification for cruelty. Their relatives, especially a stepmother who had always carried bitterness in her heart, took advantage of these rumors. She had never loved the girls, treating them as burdens that ate too much food and contributed too little. The sight of their closeness only deepened her resentment, for she could not bear to watch them find joy in each other while her own heart was empty. She began to fuel the whispers, quietly telling others, "They bring bad luck. Since their voices are always together, perhaps one day their grief will bring ruin." The more she spoke, the more people believed, because it was easier to blame the sisters for misfortunes than to confront their own failings. When crops withered after too much rain, some villagers muttered that it was the fault of the sisters. When a child fell sick, people whispered that their laughter had drawn spirits to punish the village. The sisters themselves never understood why these looks of suspicion followed them, why people muttered when they passed, or why their small acts of kindness were twisted into something sinister. If the younger gave food to a hungry child, others claimed it was only a bribe to cover her cursed nature. If the older helped mend someone's clothes, people said she was weaving spells into the fabric. The seeds of envy did not remain whispers for long. Children who once merely teased them grew crueler, emboldened by the adults' words. Stones were thrown more often. Names more venomous were shouted at them in the streets: "Witch, curse, stormbringer." Even elders, who should have known better, dismissed the sisters' innocence with cold eyes, saying, "If such closeness was meant to be, the gods would not have made them suffer so much already." It was as though their very bond became a mirror that reflected the villagers' own emptiness, and the reflection enraged them. The sisters, however, clung to one another even more tightly. They whispered comfort when the world seemed to turn against them, trying to remind themselves that love was stronger than lies. But in the silence of night, the older sister sometimes wept quietly, wondering why kindness bred cruelty, and why their togetherness became something to be feared. The younger would wipe her tears, singing softly until the weight lifted for a while. Yet even as they found solace in each other, they could not stop the vines of envy from spreading. By now, the village was convinced that the bond of the sisters was not a blessing but a threat. The whispers had taken root in every heart, twisting what was pure into something sinister. What had begun as envy of their closeness had become a shadow growing larger every day, waiting for a chance to strike. The sisters could not see how dangerous the envy had grown, but the village had already decided that their bond was not to be celebrated, it was to be feared. It happened not suddenly, but like a storm that had been gathering for too long, heavy with the weight of envy and fear. The villagers, their hearts twisted by suspicion and lies, had convinced themselves that one of the sisters must be destroyed if the village were ever to know peace. Whispers turned into plans, and plans became a night filled with cruelty. The chosen victim was the younger sister, for her laughter was purest, her songs sweetest, and her tears seemed to stir nature itself. The villagers told themselves that silencing her voice would silence the curse. In truth, it was envy that sharpened their blades and hardened their hearts. The stepmother played her part as if she were innocent, her voice dripping with false concern. She told the girls that the village had finally decided to forgive them, that they were invited to share a meal beneath the great tree at the edge of the fields. The older sister was wary, her heart uneasy, but the younger, ever hopeful, believed in the promise of peace. With gentle insistence, she convinced her elder sibling to come with her, her bright eyes filled with trust that for once, kindness might prevail. When they arrived, the scene was too quiet. The shadows of men moved between the trees, their faces lit by torchlight but twisted by something darker than fire. At first, the sisters thought it was simply a gathering, but then rough hands seized them. They cried out, struggling, but the sound of their voices was drowned by mocking laughter. The older sister tried to shield the younger, pulling her close, but the villagers tore them apart with cruel determination. The betrayal was sharpest when the stepmother stepped forward, her face not sorrowful but filled with a cold triumph. "It is her," she declared, pointing at the younger sister. "Her songs, her tears, her laughter, they draw the spirits against us. Tonight we end it." The villagers, emboldened by her words, shouted in agreement. Stones were thrown at the girl, striking her face and shoulders, not to kill but to weaken, to break her spirit before her body. She fell to the ground, her arms raised in futile defense, tears streaking through the dust on her cheeks. Some of the men dragged her to the riverbank, where the moonlight turned the water into a silver mirror. "If her tears feed the river," one of them sneered, "then let the river feed on her." They pushed her beneath the current, their hands holding her down as she thrashed. The older sister screamed until her voice broke, clawing at them, but they struck her back with fists and kicks until she collapsed. The villagers watched as the younger girl's struggles grew weaker, bubbles rising in frantic bursts before fading altogether. When at last they pulled her body from the water, limp and lifeless, they laid her at the feet of her stepmother. The woman looked upon the girl she had destroyed and smiled, as if victory had finally been hers. The villagers muttered among themselves that the curse was broken, that the danger had been silenced. But their eyes could not meet each other's for long, for in their hearts they knew the truth. It had not been a curse they destroyed but innocence itself. The older sister knelt by the body, sobbing into her sister's wet hair, her cries echoing into the night. The villagers turned away, their laughter fading into uneasy silence. The act was done. The girl's light had been extinguished by their envy, her voice silenced forever, or so they thought. The night after her sister's murder was not quiet. The village thought it would be, thought that the silencing of the younger girl would bring peace, but the world itself seemed unsettled. The surviving sister knelt on the riverbank where her sister's body had last breathed, her hands trembling as she clutched the soaked fabric of her garment. Her sobs tore through the silence, raw and aching, louder than any song her sister had once sung. She did not wail for pity or plead for forgiveness. Her cries were not meant for the ears of villagers who had betrayed them both. They were meant for the heavens, for the earth, for anything greater than human cruelty that might hear. The first cry left her throat as if it were ripped from her very soul. It rolled across the waters, trembling through the reeds and rushing over the surface of the river. Birds startled from their nests and took to the sky in panic, their wings beating frantically as though the sound had pierced their dreams. The trees shuddered as if struck by an unseen wind, their branches swaying though the air was still. Somewhere far away, wolves lifted their heads and howled in response, as though acknowledging her grief. Her second cry was deeper, hoarse and filled with despair, and it seemed to strike the sky itself. Clouds, thin at first, gathered above, covering the moon's silver light. The stars vanished behind veils of darkness, and the heavens grew heavy. The villagers, who had returned to their homes thinking the matter ended, stirred uneasily in their beds as they heard the sound of the girl's anguish rolling through the night. Some turned their faces away, covering their ears, but the echo followed them even into their dreams. Then came her third cry, a cry of both mourning and rage, and with it the wind stirred. It rose suddenly without warning, bending tall grasses and snapping branches from trees. Dust swirled into the air, carrying with it the smell of rain though no drop had yet fallen. The villagers stepped outside their huts, looking up at the sky in growing fear, whispering that something was wrong. But none dared to go to the girl, none dared to comfort her. They knew the weight of what they had done. She lay her head on the earth beside the river, whispering her sister's name over and over between sobs, her tears soaking into the soil. The ground itself seemed to shiver under her grief, small cracks opening near the water's edge. She struck her fists against the ground in helplessness, but each strike felt answered, first by the rumble of distant thunder, then by the faint tremor of earth beneath her hands. As the hours passed, the sky grew darker still. Lightning forked across the horizon, illuminating the river in flashes of silver and white. The air carried a weight, a charge that made the skin prickle and the heart pound. Animals in the village bleated and cried, restless in their pens. Dogs barked at the air, then whined and tucked their tails between their legs. The storm that brewed was not like ordinary storms. It was not called by the turn of the season or the whim of clouds. It was answering her grief, her voice, her sorrow. Every cry she released seemed to weave itself into the rising storm. The thunder became her echo, repeating her anguish back to the land. The winds carried her despair into every hut, every corner of the village, making the guilty shiver though they tried to dismiss it. Some of the elders whispered to each other, their voices trembling, "The storm belongs to her. The spirits are listening." Still none dared to act. At last, as dawn threatened on the horizon, the surviving sister's voice cracked into silence, her body shaking with exhaustion. She collapsed on the riverbank, her tears still flowing silently down her face. Above her the storm refused to pass. The clouds circled, the thunder rolled, the lightning danced. Her cries had awakened something vast, something more powerful than the cruelty of men, and now the storm itself seemed to carry her grief forward, unwilling to let the world forget what had been done. The day after her cries shook the night, the village woke to an air thick with unease. The sun should have risen bright, but instead, a strange dimness lingered over the land. Clouds pressed low and heavy, the sky a restless gray. Even the birds seemed hesitant to sing, their voices swallowed by a silence that weighed on every living thing. Men carried their tools to the fields, women fetched water from the river, yet all moved quickly, glancing upward with wary eyes. Something was waiting above them like a clenched fist about to fall. By midday the first storm broke. Not the gentle kind that watered crops, nor the seasonal rains that brought relief from heat. This storm came roaring from nowhere, violent and sudden, as if the heavens themselves had torn open. Winds whipped through the village with a fury that bent trees and sent thatched roofs trembling. Dust and debris swirled through the air. Children clung to their mothers, animals scattered in panic, and the villagers rushed to shutter their doors. Then came the rain. Sheets of water poured down, so heavy that sight blurred beyond a few paces. The river swelled, foaming and churning, threatening to climb its banks. Paths became rivers of mud, and huts groaned under the assault. Thunder cracked above with such force it rattled the very bones of the people hiding inside their homes. Lightning streaked the sky, jagged and merciless, striking so close that the ground shook with each blast. But it was not the violence of the storm that unsettled them most, it was the voice. At first, it was faint, woven between the rolls of thunder, a whisper so subtle that many dismissed it as imagination. A name carried on the wind, a breath between lightning strikes, as though the storm itself had something to say. Some villagers shook their heads, muttering to themselves, telling their children to stay quiet. But others, those whose hands had been stained with betrayal, froze. Their eyes widened. They had heard it clearly. It was her voice. The slain sisters. Why? The words slithered through the cracks of thunder, soft yet piercing. Why did you betray me? The villagers who heard it felt their blood run cold. Women dropped their water jars. Men stumbled to their knees, their faces pale with dread. Yet when they asked others if they had heard it too, most only shook their heads, unwilling to admit the truth. To confess hearing it was to confess guilt, or at least belief in what the world refused to explain. As the storm raged on, the voice grew bolder. With every crash of thunder came fragments of her sorrow. Sister, it wept. They have taken me. At times it sounded no more than a whisper, curling through the rain like mist. At others, it roared with the lightning, echoing so powerfully it seemed the earth itself had spoken. Those who had taken part in her murder dared not step outside, but no walls could keep the voice away. It seeped through the cracks of doors, slid under rooftops and hovered above their trembling heads. They stuffed their ears with cloth, pressed their palms tight against the sides of their faces, but still it slipped through. Her presence was inescapable. By evening, fear had gripped the entire village. Children wept without knowing why, sensing the terror in their parents' hearts. Elders murmured that such storms were punishments, that when the dead were wronged, their spirits returned in anger. Some whispered that the sister's cries from the night before had reached beyond the earth, summoning her slain sibling back in a voice carried by rain and thunder. And still the storm did not end. Hour after hour it lashed the land, drowning the fields, battering the huts, testing the courage of every soul who cowered beneath its weight. And in every pause between thunderclaps, in every howl of the wind, the voice lingered, calling, questioning, haunting. It was the first storm of its kind, and no one in the village ever forgot it. Few admitted what they had heard, but in their eyes lay the same fear, the same terrible knowledge. The dead did not The guilty ones thought at first they might outrun the storm. They whispered to each other in secret, plotting escape before their names were spoken again. But the storm was merciless. It did not need eyes to see nor hands to grab. It hunted them through rain, thunder, and wind. The first to fall was the man who had struck the killing blow. He had been strong once, proud of his strength, boasting that no woman's cry could weaken him. But when the storm's voice called his name, he shivered like a child. That night, as lightning danced across the sky, a single bolt came down with terrifying precision. It struck him where he stood, splitting the tree above his head and burning his body until nothing remained but charred earth. The villagers found him at dawn, his face twisted as if frozen mid-scream. None doubted that the storm had chosen him first. Another of the guilty, a woman who had lured the sister to the place of betrayal, fled toward the river, believing she could hide in the dense reeds. But the rains had swollen the waters, and the river no longer flowed as it once had. It churned violently, pulling at its banks as if eager to devour. When her name echoed through the storm, she stumbled, and before she could rise, the river surged forward, swallowing her whole. Villagers who watched from the safety of higher ground claimed they saw her hands flail above the current, but the storm's thunder roared louder than her cries. By morning her body was gone, leaving only swirling waters. Others suffered differently. The cousin who had spread lies, whispering poison into people's ears, found himself plagued not by lightning or floods but by the voice itself. Night after night, it circled him, calling his name with relentless persistence. He stuffed his ears with cloth, pressed his hands against his head, but still the voice seeped through, filling his mind with guilt. He grew pale, his eyes hollow, his sleep broken by nightmares where the murdered sister stood before him, her lips moving with the storm's words. Madness claimed him before death did. He wandered through the village screaming for silence until the rains dragged him into the mud, and there he lay, his body lifeless, his face frozen in terror. The village began to tremble. Each day brought another punishment, another guilty one swallowed by the storm's wrath. No one could predict how it would come. Some houses were torn apart by winds so fierce they left only shattered wood and broken walls. Others were drowned where they stood as if the ground itself opened to drink them. And always the voice named them first. It was not random, it was deliberate, a justice carried on storm clouds. Even those who had not lifted their hands but had laughed, mocked, or turned their faces away in silence found themselves cursed. Their animals sickened, their harvests rotted, their dreams filled with the slain sister's whispers. Some fell to their knees, begging the surviving sister for forgiveness, their tears mixing with the rain. But the girl, broken by grief, could not speak for them or against them. She too heard the voice and knew it was not hers to control. The innocent watched with terror, yet also with awe. They whispered that this was not merely revenge, it was a cleansing. The murdered girl's voice, carried through the storm, had become something greater than human. It was the spirit of justice itself, refusing to let cruelty stand. Children clung to their mothers, asking why the skies were so angry, and the mothers told them in hushed tones that the blood of the innocent cries louder than any prayer. Day after day, night after night, the storm claimed its victims. Lightning split huts in two, rain turned paths into rivers, and thunder carried names across the valley. The guilty dwindled. Where once they strutted proudly, now they cowered in corners, unable to sleep, unable to breathe without fearing the next storm. Their pride, their cruelty, their laughter, all had turned to terror. One night, when the winds were at their strongest, the villagers gathered in fear. The surviving sister stood among them, her face pale but her eyes burning. Above them, the murdered sister's voice rose higher than ever before. It named the last of the guilty, her words cracking like thunder, and in that moment the sky itself seemed to split apart. Lightning struck again and again, drowning out the screams until silence fell. The storm did not vanish entirely, but its fury softened. Rain still fell, but no longer in sheets of destruction. The wind still blew, but with less rage. The villagers looked around at their broken homes, their flooded fields, their dwindling numbers, and they understood. The guilty had been taken. The voice had delivered judgment. And though the storms might return, they would never again forget the terror that comes when cruelty tries to silence love. The village had endured many nights of storms, each more violent than the last, each carrying the relentless voice of the slain sister. Yet nothing could have prepared the villagers for what was to come. One evening, as the sky darkened unnaturally early, a silence fell over the land that was heavier than any storm. Birds stopped singing, animals crouched low, and the wind itself held its breath. The survivors shivered, sensing that the final reckoning was at hand. Then the storm erupted. It was unlike anything they had ever seen. The clouds rolled in like mountains, black and furious, blotting out even the faintest glimmer of moonlight. Lightning streaked across the sky, splitting the heavens into jagged, white fire. Thunder followed, not in isolated crashes, but as a continuous roar, shaking the very earth beneath their feet. Rain fell in torrents, not gently but like rivers from the sky, lashing against rooftops, flooding streets, and ripping at thatched walls. Trees snapped like twigs under the force of the wind, their roots torn from the earth, crashing onto homes and villagers alike. Amid the chaos, the voice of the murdered sister rose above all else. Louder than thunder, sharper than lightning, it boomed across the valley, echoing from hill to hill. Her words were no longer whispers or murmurs. They demanded justice, naming each guilty soul with perfect clarity. It was a sound that penetrated the bones, rattled the hearts, and froze the blood of those who had tried to silence her. Every guilty person felt the storm descend directly upon them. Huts collapsed over heads, walls splintered, and the very earth seemed to reject their presence. Those who tried to flee were swept away by sudden floods that rose from nowhere, torrents of water carrying mud and debris like a force of nature intent on retribution. Even the strongest among them could not stand against the combined power of wind, water, and voice. Lightning struck with unnerving precision, targeting those whose hands had spilled blood, whose hearts had harbored envy and malice. Flames erupted where the strikes hit, consuming buildings, granaries, and fields, leaving only ashes in their wake. The villagers watched, paralyzed by fear, as homes crumbled, trees fell, and the storm showed no mercy. The voice repeated the names of the guilty with each crash of thunder, reinforcing the certainty that nothing could escape judgment. The surviving sister moved among the chaos, her own fear mingled with awe. She could see the silver glow that hovered around the murdered sister's presence, a spectral light that seemed to guide the storms. Though powerless to stop it, she understood that the storms were not born of anger alone. They were instruments of justice, carefully wielded by the voice of the one who had been silenced. Rivers overflowed their banks, swallowing bridges, roads, and homes. Torrential rain washed away livestock, crops, and fields. The wind tore thatch and timber from the village's structures, hurling debris like weapons at the fleeing and the guilty. Every clap of thunder shook the ground as if the earth itself was participating in the judgment. In the midst of this, the voice grew even louder, resonating in the hearts of all who had wronged the sisters. Each syllable carried weight, commanding the elements to act, demanding that every injustice be accounted for. Windows shattered, walls cracked, and even the proudest men were brought low by fear and guilt. By the time dawn approached, the storm had consumed the village almost entirely. Only remnants of homes remained, half buried in mud and water. The few survivors, mostly innocent bystanders who had dared not lift a hand against the sisters, cowered, trembling at the devastation around them. The air was heavy with silence now, punctuated only by the distant rolling of thunder and the faint echo of a voice that had ensured its vengeance. The storm of vengeance had passed, leaving behind a landscape transformed. What had once been a village of cruelty was now a testament to the wrath of a voice that could not be silenced. The murdered sister's power had been fully unleashed, her justice delivered with precision and fury. Every guilty soul had been accounted for, every betrayal punished, and the surviving sister finally understood the extent of her sibling's strength, even in death. The storm receded slowly as if reluctant to leave, dragging its clouds across the horizon in heavy, rolling remnants. Rain still fell in scattered sheets, soaking the battered land, but the wind had calmed, and the thunder had retreated to distant echoes. The village, once alive with the sounds of daily life, now lay in silence, broken only by the soft drip of water from shattered rooftops and the murmur of swollen rivers. The air was thick with mud, the scent of charred wood and wet earth mingling, a tangible reminder of the storm's fury. The guilty were gone. Some had been struck down by lightning, others drowned in the floodwaters, and the few who had survived the storm were too broken, physically and spiritually, to return to the lives they had once known. Their faces, now pale and hollowed by fear, reflected the weight of justice that had come upon them. No laughter remained, no mocking whispers dared escape their lips. Even those who had once considered themselves untouchable now walked with bowed heads, eyes fixed firmly on the ground, haunted by the memory of the storm and the relentless voice that had delivered judgment. The surviving sister moved through the ruins with slow, deliberate steps. Her feet sank into the mud, leaving small, careful prints in the sodden earth. The destruction around her was total. Homes lay in splintered ruin, barns had collapsed under the weight of water and wind, and fields that had once promised life now stood submerged or shredded by debris. Yet amid the devastation she felt an unfamiliar calm. She no longer cried, no longer trembled. The fear that had clung to her heart was gone, replaced by a quiet resolve and a profound sense of witnessing justice fulfilled. The remnants of the village's people gathered at the edges of what remained, their eyes wide with fear and awe. They spoke little, each word carrying a weight of shame. Mothers held their children close, explaining in whispered tones the price of cruelty. Fathers stared at the ruined earth, murmuring apologies to a power they could not comprehend. The surviving sister, though only a young girl herself, stood taller than any adult present. Her gaze swept across the village with clarity and quiet authority. She had been given a lesson in sorrow, betrayal, and loss, but she had also witnessed the reckoning of justice. Around her, nature seemed to pause in reverent silence. The wind no longer howled, though it carried the faint scent of rain-soaked earth and smoke. The rivers, though swollen, flowed more gently, and the clouds that had raged in anger now hung in soft, gray stillness, as though bowing to the memory of the storms and the voice that had commanded them. Birds began to return to the broken trees, warily at first, cautious of the devastated land. Even the sun, peeking through heavy clouds, seemed hesitant, casting a muted light over the village, illuminating its scars and the solemn faces of the survivors. For the surviving sister, the aftermath was both heavy and liberating. She walked among the remnants of homes and fields, observing the quiet faces of those who had escaped punishment. She no longer wept, for the tears that had once flowed in grief had been replaced by a deeper understanding, that justice, though cruel, could restore balance. Her bond with her slain sister remained unbroken, felt in every gust of wind, every ripple of water, every whisper of the lingering storm. It was a reminder that some connections, forged in life and tempered in death, transcended even the most violent of acts. The villagers, humbled and fearful, began to rebuild, but they did so with caution and respect. The laughter, mockery, and cruelty that had once defined their days were gone, replaced by a wary reverence for the power they had witnessed. The surviving sister became a quiet figure among them, not as one of fear but as a living testament to the justice that had fallen from the skies. She did not command, she did not threaten. She simply existed, a reminder that innocence, once taken, could still wield a power far beyond human comprehension. And so, the village endured, forever scarred yet forever changed. The storm had passed, the guilty had been silenced, and the surviving sister, standing alone amid the ruins, carried the quiet strength of one who had seen the full measure of vengeance and justice. She no longer wept, for there was no need. The voice of her sister had spoken, the storms had raged, and the land itself had remembered. The story of the sisters, the one taken violently and the other who survived, spread far beyond the shattered village, carried on whispers, winds, and the quiet murmurings of travelers who had glimpsed the aftermath of the storm. Word of the storms that raged with a voice, the floods that obeyed the cries of the innocent, and the relentless justice delivered upon those who had committed unspeakable cruelty reached neighboring villages and distant settlements. Every retelling carried with it both awe and fear, a lesson etched into the consciousness of anyone who heard it. Parents used the tale to teach their children the cost of malice. Mothers whispered at bedtime of the two sisters, describing how envy, greed, and cruelty could summon vengeance from the very skies. Fathers spoke of the surviving sister, whose grief and love had transformed into a quiet, unyielding strength, a force that had ensured the guilty could not escape their fate. Every child grew up knowing that innocence, though often overlooked or mocked, held power beyond human understanding, and that the natural world itself could be an instrument of justice. Travelers who passed near the ruins of the storm-ravaged village told stories of the land scarred by divine wrath. They described rivers still swollen from the torrents that had once carried the voices of the slain, trees twisted into unnatural shapes by winds that obeyed the call for vengeance, and fields that had never fully recovered, forever marked by the justice of the storm-speaking sister. Each tale reminded listeners that acts of cruelty were not forgotten, that the bonds of family and the sanctity of life carried consequences that even the sky would uphold. Over time, the legend became ritualized in neighboring villages. On certain nights, especially when storms gathered on the horizon, elders would tell children to remain close to their homes, warning that the wind might carry whispers of those who had been wronged. They recounted how the surviving sister had stood alone amidst destruction, her eyes reflecting both sorrow and the quiet satisfaction of justice fulfilled. It was said that when the storm spoke, it was her sister's voice, reminding the world that vengeance could be as gentle as a whisper or as violent as a tempest. Merchants and travelers passing through the region carried the story across vast lands, embellishing details but keeping the central truth intact. Cruelty toward the innocent would not go unanswered. The sister who survived became a symbol, a living embodiment of the justice that nature itself could deliver. In homes, families would leave small offerings during storms, not out of worship, but in respect for the balance maintained by her actions, acknowledging that even those unseen could shape the fates of the living. The surviving sister herself lived quietly after the storms. Though she never sought revenge again, the memory of her sister and the events that had transpired lingered like a shadow around her. Villagers who had once scorned her now treated her with cautious reverence. They watched her from a distance, careful not to provoke the force that had already demonstrated its power. She carried her sister's memory in silence, a quiet sentinel who needed no voice to command respect. Her presence alone reminded everyone that injustice, when committed, was not easily erased. Even years later, long after the village had begun to recover, storms would occasionally stir in ways that reminded the people of what had occurred. Thunder rumbled in patterns that felt like words, rain fell in sudden torrents, and winds whispered across the plains, carrying with them a subtle warning. The past is never truly buried, and innocence wronged may yet call forth justice. Stories would be told anew each generation, emphasizing the sacred lesson: protect the innocent, honor the bonds of family, and never allow cruelty to go unchecked. The legacy of the storm-speaking sister thus endured across generations. Her tale was not merely of vengeance, but of balance and moral reckoning. It taught that those who attempt to harm the innocent may face consequences far greater than imagined, and that the bonds of love and loyalty, even when stretched by tragedy, could transcend death and summon powers beyond comprehension. The sister's story became a cornerstone of moral teaching. The living must respect the sanctity of life, for the skies and storms themselves remember every injustice. Parents would whisper to their children, "Do not harm the innocent, for the storms remember, and the wind carries the voice of those wronged." In that simple warning lay the weight of the legend. One sister's death had awakened a force that would not be silenced, and the surviving sister, though quiet, became a living testament to the truth that even the heavens demand justice. Across lands near and far, the tale spread, a story of sorrow, power, and the unyielding force of righteous vengeance. The story of the two sisters spread far and wide, carried by the whispers of travelers, the winds that swept across valleys, and the murmurs of those who had witnessed the storm's fury. In every village, in every home where the tale reached, it became a lesson woven into the fabric of daily life. Parents would gather their children close, speaking softly but firmly about the price of cruelty and the sanctity of life. They told of how one sister had been killed through betrayal and malice, how her voice, though silenced in death, rose through the storms to demand justice, and how the surviving sister had become the vessel of that reckoning. In the villages that had once laughed at weakness, mothers now held their children tighter during storms, whispering warnings: "Never harm the innocent, never mock those who cannot defend themselves, for the world and even the skies remember." Fathers, who might have dismissed such tales as mere superstition, often found themselves uneasy in the presence of sudden tempests, recalling the legend of the storm-speaking sister and the calamities that befell the guilty. The story became a moral compass, a cautionary tale that no act of cruelty went unseen or unanswered. Travelers carried the tale across distant lands, embellishing its details while preserving its core truth. Injustice toward the innocent would inevitably be punished, and those who dared commit such acts could find themselves the targets of forces beyond human comprehension. The surviving sister, though quiet and reserved, became a symbol of enduring strength and resilience. Her presence, often seen at the periphery of villages that had been touched by her legend, reminded everyone that even silence could harbor immense power, and that the bonds of love and loyalty extended beyond the boundaries of life and death. In time, the story became ritualized in villages near and far. On stormy nights, children were told to stay indoors and listen closely to the winds, for it was said that the voice of the slain sister might ride upon them. Elders spoke of her with reverence, recounting the events that had unfolded and emphasizing that the balance of justice had been restored through extraordinary means. The surviving sister's quiet walk among the ruins of her village became emblematic of dignity, strength, and the inexorable power of truth. The land itself bore traces of the storm and the justice it carried. Rivers once swollen receded slowly, leaving behind marks in the earth, while trees bent and twisted in ways that spoke of the forces unleashed. Fields that had been ravaged by the tempest slowly healed, but the memory of devastation lingered, a constant reminder of the consequences of cruelty. Nature in its own way had become an instrument of moral reckoning, echoing the message carried by the sister's story: innocence wronged must not be ignored, lest the consequences reach far beyond human control. For the surviving sister, life moved forward quietly but with purpose. She never sought vengeance again, for the storms had already fulfilled their role. Yet her very presence served as a living testament to the lessons learned. Villagers treated her with cautious respect, aware that she embodied the enduring memory of justice delivered. Even in moments of peace, the knowledge that the storms remembered, and that the voice of her sister might still be heard, lingered in the minds of all who had been touched by the tale. Across generations the legend endured. Storytellers recounted the tale to warn against cruelty, teaching that the smallest acts of malice could summon consequences far greater than imagined. The sisters' bond, one tragically broken and the other unyielding, became a symbol of the unassailable power of love, loyalty, and moral justice. The tale emphasized that nature itself could rise in defense of the innocent, that voices silenced in life could echo through storms, and that vengeance, when righteous, would always find its mark. The legend of the storm-speaking sister thus became immortal. Across lands and through countless retellings, her story reminded people that injustice, betrayal, and cruelty were never forgotten. Parents, speaking to wide-eyed children, reminded them of the girls whose lives and deaths had shaped the very forces of nature. "Do not spill innocent blood," they said, "for even the sky remembers." And in that simple admonition lay the weight of a story that transcended generations, a tale of sorrow, justice, and the unbreakable bonds between sisters, whose love and vengeance had become inseparable from the storms themselves.